The train departed before she allowed herself the chance to reconsider. Its weight and noise faded into the distance, leaving behind a platform already reclaiming its emptiness. Wind rose across the tracks, lifting dust into the air, scattering it over the boards and along the edge of her boots. The station seemed to erase itself as quickly as her last opportunity to turn back. Ellen Hart remained where she was, a single figure with a travel bag, standing in a town that did not belong to any memory she carried. The place looked unfinished, as though it had been built to serve a purpose that no longer existed. A narrow row of wooden buildings leaned against the horizon, their windows dull, their paint bleached into resignation. Nothing here announced arrival. In the letters, the town had been described without detail, reduced to a promise rather than a location, a place where one could begin again. Paper had not warned her how silence could feel so heavy. She held her bag tighter than necessary. It contained little, yet it represented everything she had not left behind. Clothing folded with care, a few personal items, and a weight she carried inside herself that could not be set down. She did not look back toward the tracks. Looking back had always been the moment when resolve failed. Remaining still was easier. Montana greeted her without warmth. The sky was clear, but the light felt distant, revealing rather than comforting. The air carried no welcome, only space. People passed at intervals, their attention brief, their expressions closed. To them she was temporary by default, another traveler misaligned with the rhythm of the place.
She waited, not because she trusted the outcome, but because waiting was the only option left. The man she had crossed half the country for did not arrive immediately. Minutes passed, stretching thin. A familiar tension settled into her chest, the kind that always appeared when expectation outlived certainty. She had learned how to endure it without outward sign. She remained upright, composed, refusing to let the moment expose her. When he appeared, it was without announcement. He came from the far end of the street, moving at an unhurried pace, as though time itself adjusted to him. It felt intentional, as if he were measuring her patience or her resolve. Nathan Cole looked shaped by the land around him, his posture steady, his presence grounded. There was nothing dramatic in the way he approached, no hesitation, no rush. He seemed accustomed to waiting for things to settle. He did not close the distance between them. He stopped short, leaving space untouched. His expression revealed nothing of expectation or judgment. He did not offer a gesture of greeting, nor did he signal impatience. The air between them became charged with the weight of what was unspoken. That distance was the first boundary, and she felt it immediately. Ellen noticed the way he observed without staring. His attention rested on her briefly, then shifted, as though allowing her time to adjust. The absence of scrutiny unsettled her more than curiosity would have. She was used to being measured, assessed, decided upon. Here, she was simply present, neither claimed nor dismissed.
The journey to the house passed in silence. The road stretched outward, the land opening into wide, indifferent space. The wheels of the wagon cut through dust, leaving a thin trail behind them that disappeared almost instantly. Ellen watched the horizon, memorizing the shape of hills and the scatter of trees, afraid that if she did not imprint the landscape now, it would reject her later. Nathan kept his focus ahead. His stillness suggested control rather than indifference. The house emerged gradually, set apart from the town, distant enough to belong more to the land than to the settlement. It stood alone, weathered but upright, its lines simple and unadorned. The wood bore the marks of time and use, not neglect. There was nothing inviting about it, yet nothing hostile either. It existed without apology. Ellen stopped at the edge of the yard. The structure did not resemble refuge. It resembled a decision waiting to be made. She felt the weight of the threshold before she reached it. This was not a place that promised safety. It offered only the possibility of staying. Nathan did not urge her forward. He remained still, slightly removed, as though recognizing the importance of the pause. Wind moved through the grass, brushing against her skirt, carrying the scent of dry earth. The silence pressed in, not demanding but persistent. She realized that no one here expected her to belong. That knowledge was both frightening and strangely freeing. In that moment, everything could have ended. She could have turned away, chosen motion over uncertainty. The story required nothing more from her. Yet standing there, she felt the exhaustion of constant escape settle into her bones. The thought of leaving again felt heavier than the risk of staying. She stepped forward, not with confidence, but with resolve born of weariness. The house did not change. The land did not respond. Only the distance behind her shifted, closing without ceremony. What waited ahead remained unknown, but for the first time in a long while, she did not feel pursued. The house revealed itself slowly, not all at once. It did not invite her in, but it did not push her out either. Its rooms were plain, almost severe, shaped by function rather than comfort. Every object appeared to belong exactly where it stood, as if anything moved without purpose would be noticed. There were no personal traces waiting for her, no signs prepared for an arrival. It felt less like a home shared and more like a structure that had learned how to stand alone. Ellen moved through it carefully. She placed her bag near the wall and left it there longer than necessary, as though unpacking would signal an assumption she was not ready to make. She walked lightly, aware of the sound of her steps, measuring the space she occupied. Her body held itself in quiet readiness, the way it always had when staying somewhere temporarily. She behaved as though the request to leave might come at any moment, spoken or not. Nathan kept his distance. He was present in the house the way a boundary is present, felt more than seen. He passed through rooms without lingering, his movements economical, deliberate. When he worked, he did so with the same restraint, never drawing attention to himself. He neither watched her nor avoided her. He existed beside her, separate, as if giving the silence a chance to test her. The days settled into a rhythm without ceremony. Morning light entered through the windows without warmth, illuminating dust and bare wood. Ellen found tasks for herself without being asked. She cleaned, cooked, repaired what she could. She made herself useful not as a favor, but as a way to justify her presence. Nathan did not interfere. He accepted the results of her work without comment, without praise. This absence of reaction unsettled her at first. She had learned to read approval and anger quickly. Here, neither came. At night, the house grew heavier. The walls seemed to hold their breath. Ellen lay awake, listening to the sounds of the structure, the wind moving outside, the occasional shift of wood under cooling air. The nights stretched longer than she expected. Tension filled the spaces between each sound, unresolved and unnamed. She waited for something to happen, some demand, some intrusion that would force her to react. It never came. Nathan did not cross into her space. Doors remained where they were. Distance was preserved with care. His restraint was precise, almost deliberate, and over time she began to sense that it was not indifference. It was choice. He controlled himself the way one controls fire, by respecting its reach. His care existed in what he did not do. She did not recognize this immediately. At first, she mistook the quiet for judgment, the distance for rejection. But as days passed without incident, without pressure, her body began to soften. Her shoulders lowered, her breath slowed. She started to move more freely through the rooms, no longer counting her steps. The house, unchanged, felt different. It did not warm, but it stopped resisting her. She noticed the steadiness of the place. Meals appeared when they should. Work was done regardless of weather. Repairs were handled before they became problems. Nothing dramatic occurred, yet everything endured. There were no promises offered, no assurances spoken, but there was continuity. The house did not ask her to believe in the future. It only asked her to exist in the present. Ellen began to understand that nothing here would be taken from her suddenly. The absence of demand became its own form of safety. Nathan's presence remained consistent, predictable. He did not test her limits. He respected them. In that respect, the house mirrored him. Both held their shape. Both waited without expectation. She started to sleep more deeply. Her dreams grew quieter.
The tension that once filled her nights loosened its grip, replaced by a cautious calm. She was still alert, still prepared to leave if necessary, but the urgency had faded. The house had not claimed her, it had simply allowed her to stay. There were no assurances of permanence, no declarations of intent, yet the structure held, day after day. In a life shaped by instability, this quiet persistence mattered more than comfort. There were no words binding her to the place, but the steadiness itself began to hold her, stronger than any promise ever had. The town revealed itself slowly, but when it did, it left no room for denial. Ellen encountered it in fragments at first, in the ordinary movements of daily life. A figure passing too close, a familiar posture glimpsed from a distance, a sound that did not belong to the present. One look was enough, one coincidence. Her body reacted before her mind could intervene, tightening, recoiling, remembering what it had learned to survive. Fear returned without warning, sharp and physical, bypassing thought entirely. She moved through the streets with renewed caution. The buildings felt closer than before, the open spaces less forgiving. The town no longer appeared indifferent. It watched her in ways she could not name. Every step required effort. Every pause carried weight. She understood then that distance did not erase memory. It only waited. The past did not announce itself with clarity. It surfaced through sensation, through instinct, through the sudden certainty that danger could exist anywhere. At the same time, Nathan was injured. It happened away from the house, during work that required strength and familiarity with risk. The wound was not fatal, but it was enough to disrupt the controlled order of his life. Blood made visible what he usually kept contained. His movements slowed, his solitude fractured. For the first time, he could not maintain the distance that defined him. Ellen saw him return altered, not weakened in a way that invited pity, but exposed. Pain changed the way he carried himself, forced him into stillness. She became aware of him not as a fixed presence in the house, but as a body subject to limits. The steadiness she had relied on revealed its seams. It unsettled her, and yet it drew her closer. She tended to what needed tending. Her hands moved with care she did not question. Fear did not disappear, but it shifted its focus. Attention replaced vigilance. The rhythm of her days adjusted around his injury. She noticed the marks on his skin, old scars layered beneath the new wound. They spoke of choices made long before her arrival, choices that carried consequences without explanation. There was no heroism in them, no performance, only evidence of survival that demanded its own price. Nathan did not resist her presence. He allowed it without comment, without gratitude. His acceptance was quiet, almost reluctant, but it was real. The space between them narrowed, not by intention, but by necessity. Ellen became aware of how rarely she had been permitted to give care without obligation. Here, there was no demand attached, only the act itself. Her fear did not vanish. The town still pressed against her awareness, still carried the echo of what she had fled. But now there was another truth alongside it. She was no longer alone with it. Nathan's vulnerability altered the balance between them. He was no longer only the one who provided distance and structure. He was someone who required presence. In caring for him, Ellen recognized something unexpected. The tension she had held since arriving began to loosen. Her vigilance softened into attention that did not exhaust her. She learned the patterns of his pain, the times when movement cost him more than he allowed. She learned restraint, not as withdrawal, but as respect. Nathan, in turn, adjusted to being seen. His injury stripped away the ease of isolation. He could no longer disappear into routine. He endured her proximity with the same discipline he applied to everything else, but beneath it, something shifted. He allowed her to witness the cost of the life he had chosen, not through confession, but through endurance. What formed between them was not closeness in the way she had known before. It was recognition, an acknowledgement that each carried a history that could not be undone. They did not mirror each other's wounds, but they understood their weight. This understanding did not comfort. It demanded honesty of presence. The house changed subtly, not in structure,
but an atmosphere. Silence remained, but it was no longer empty. It held awareness. Ellen felt it in the way she moved, in the way she listened. The fear she carried became one part of a larger reality, no longer the only one. She was still cautious, still alert, but she was not invisible. By the time Nathan's strength began to return, something irreversible had already occurred. The distance that once protected them both had shifted into something more dangerous. They had seen each other without defenses. They had shared a space where pretense could not survive. What existed now was not intimacy, but equality. It unsettled her more than hostility ever had. Hatred could be resisted. This required something else entirely. Time began to work against their isolation. The days no longer felt suspended, and the routine they had built started to open outward, touched by the presence of others and the demands of the land. Ellen observed Nathan beyond the boundaries of the house, saw the way he moved through the world when no one was watching closely. He offered help where it was needed and left before it could be repaid. There was no audience for his efforts, no expectation of recognition. He did what had to be done and returned without comment, carrying the weight of it quietly. Watching him altered something in her. The man she had known as distance and restraint revealed a steadiness that did not rely on control. His actions were consistent, not generous in performance, but precise in intent. She saw how people accepted his help without ceremony, how his presence did not impose. This knowledge unsettled her assumptions. It made his silence feel less like withdrawal and more like discipline. As the season shifted, Ellen began to root herself in ways she had not anticipated. Her body adjusted to the labor of the days. The land ceased to feel foreign beneath her hands. She learned the soil, its resistance, and its yield. The rhythm of work entered her muscles, steady and grounding. She no longer woke with the constant readiness to flee. Her breathing deepened. The tension that had defined her movements softened into endurance. She noticed her own reflection less often. The need to monitor herself faded. She existed in her body without suspicion. The house, once provisional, began to hold her in its patterns. She recognized moments of belonging, not as declarations, but as absences of fear. The thought of departure no longer followed her through every room. It was then that the balance shifted. Nathan began to pull away. The change was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. He spoke less through action, moved with greater reserve. The space between them widened, not abruptly, but deliberately. Ellen sensed it before she understood it. His restraint sharpened, becoming protective in a different way. He had come to realize something she had not yet voiced, that this place had offered her shelter before it offered connection, that the house had been her refuge, not her destination. The understanding did not anger him, it frightened him. He had built his life around permanence, around the certainty that what he allowed close would remain. The idea of becoming a temporary harbor unsettled him more than solitude ever had. His withdrawal carried no accusation. It was controlled, measured, but it changed the atmosphere between them. Silence returned with weight. Where it had once allowed space to breathe, it now pressed inward. Ellen felt it in the pauses between movements, in the way her presence no longer fit as easily. She recognized the shift and did not know how to counter it. For the first time, the risk clarified. It was not the loss of shelter that unsettled her. It was the possibility of losing him. The thought surfaced without drama, but it remained. She understood that her attachment had formed quietly, without her consent. She had begun to rely not on the house, but on the constancy of his presence. This realization unsettled her sense of control. She had believed herself protected by distance, by the unspoken agreement of restraint. Now she saw that something else had taken root, not desire, but dependence on stability that existed outside herself. The fear this brought was different from what she had known before. It was not immediate or violent. It was the fear of absence. She watched him more carefully, noting the discipline with which he maintained separation. His fear did not express itself through anger or rejection. It expressed itself through distance. He guarded himself from expectation the way he guarded his land, by controlling access. Ellen did not confront him. She lacked the language and the certainty. Instead, she adjusted her movements, testing the space between them. She learned its new limits. The house remained standing. The days continued. Yet something essential had shifted. The quiet that followed was heavier than before. It carried questions neither of them had chosen to ask. Ellen felt the ground beneath her feet remain solid, but she understood now that belonging was not guaranteed by place alone. It required choice, and she was no longer certain whose choice would matter most. The fire arrived without warning, carried by a wind that had changed direction too quickly to read. Smoke rose first, thin and deceptive, then thickened until the sky lost its depth. What followed moved faster than thought. Flames crossed dry ground as if it had been waiting for them. There was no pattern, no mercy in their spread. The past and the future burned with the same indifference. Ellen felt the heat before she understood the danger. The air tightened in her lungs, sharp and bitter. Ash began to fall like dark snow, settling into her hair and along the sleeves of her dress. The familiar outlines of the land blurred, replaced by movement and sound that overwhelmed orientation. The house, the barn, the fences that had once defined safety became fragile shapes against a wall of fire. Nathan moved with urgency, shaped by habit rather than panic. His body responded to threat with action, but the scale of what approached exceeded preparation. The fire advanced without pause, leaping across boundaries that had held for years. Wood cracked, metal groaned. The land that had sustained him turned hostile in minutes. Ellen saw what he reached for and what he left behind. She understood then that survival alone was not the measure of loss. There were things that could not be rebuilt from memory or labor. She recognized the weight of what he carried inside him, the quiet structure that had kept him intact through isolation and restraint. One object held that structure together, not by value, but by meaning accumulated over time. The decision formed without deliberation. Fear narrowed her focus, but clarity followed. She moved toward the house as the fire closed in, toward the space already thick with smoke and heat. The risk was immediate and unmistakable. Her body resisted even as she forced it forward. Breath burned, vision dimmed, every instinct urged retreat. She reached what she sought through instinct rather than sight. Her hands closed around it, grounding her in purpose. The moment did not feel brave, it felt necessary. She turned back as the ceiling began to fail, embers dropping around her like sparks from torn metal. The air pressed hard against her chest. She ran without seeing the path clearly, driven by the certainty that leaving empty-handed would cost more than injury. When she emerged, coughing and unsteady, the fire had already altered the landscape. Nathan reached her in time to steady her, his focus locked on the fact of her survival. The object she carried registered only afterward. He saw it then, darkened but intact, held against her body as if it had weight beyond its form. The fire continued to consume what remained. They were forced back, away from structures that could no longer be defended. Together they stood at the edge of what had been theirs, watching the collapse without movement. There was nothing left to do but remain present. When the flames finally weakened, they left behind a stripped terrain. The silence that followed was absolute. No insect stirred, no wind moved through the scorched remains. The world felt paused, emptied of its former rhythm. Smoke drifted low, blurring the horizon. Loss revealed itself slowly. The house stood damaged but hollowed. Outbuildings had fallen. The land bore blackened scars where green had once dominated. What remained was reduced to essentials. The excess had burned away. In that stillness, something shifted between them. The distance that had once served as protection no longer held. There was no role left for restraint. Ellen's choice had crossed a threshold that could not be undone. It had named what mattered without language. Nathan did not withdraw. There was no space left for it. The fire had stripped him of the illusion that stability could be maintained through control alone. What remained was the knowledge that someone had seen the core of him and acted to preserve it, not out of obligation, but out of recognition. They stood among the remnants without turning away from each other. The loss was real, but it no longer defined the limits of what could be rebuilt. The fire had taken shape and shelter, but it had clarified intention. What survived did so because it had been chosen. In the aftermath, there was no distance left to hide behind, only the shared understanding of what had been risked and why. Spring arrived in Montana with restraint. The ground resisted warmth, holding to the memory of frost and fire alike. Snow retreated slowly from the shadows, leaving behind soil that appeared lifeless at first glance. Yet beneath the surface, movement had already begun. The land did not rush its recovery, neither did the people standing within it. Ellen no longer measured her days by the thought of leaving. The road that once defined escape had lost its urgency. It still existed, stretching outward beyond the hills, but it no longer pulled at her attention. What remained instead was a sense of placement. She woke each morning with an awareness of where she was and why. The fear that had once lived in her body had not vanished, but it had settled into something quieter, something manageable. Nathan worked the land with patience shaped by loss. The fire had altered his understanding of permanence. He no longer rebuilt with the expectation that what stood would remain untouched. Instead, he rebuilt with care, choosing what mattered and letting the rest go. His movements were slower now, not from injury, but from intention. He no longer mistook endurance for isolation. What he offered Ellen was not framed as a promise. There were no declarations or conditions. He made space and left the choice within her reach. The absence of pressure carried more weight than any vow. Staying became an act of will rather than obligation. Their connection did not announce itself. It continued in shared labor, in silence that no longer concealed fear. They worked side by side, not mirroring each other, but moving in a rhythm shaped by familiarity. The land bore signs of renewal in small, deliberate ways. Green pushed through blackened soil. Shoots appeared where ash had settled thickest. Life returned without ceremony. Ellen noticed these changes with careful attention. She saw in them a reflection of what had occurred within herself. The ground did not forget the fire, but it did not remain defined by it. She understood then that survival did not require erasure, it required adaptation. She allowed herself to stand within what remained, without flinching. Nathan watched her settle into the days. He did not interpret her presence as possession. He recognized it as choice repeated quietly. Each morning she stayed was its own confirmation. The steadiness between them grew not from expectation, but from consistency. There was no urgency to define what they were becoming. The shape of it revealed itself naturally. As weeks passed, the land softened, streams ran clearer, birds returned cautiously, testing the air before committing. The earth accepted seed again. Ellen planted alongside Nathan, her hands learning the weight and resistance of soil that had once seemed hostile. The act grounded her. She felt connected not to ownership, but to continuity. They shared meals without ceremony, rested without vigilance. The house, repaired but marked, held their presence without tension. Its scars remained visible. Neither of them sought to hide them. The damage told a story of survival rather than failure. There were moments of uncertainty. They did not disappear entirely, but they no longer dictated movement. When they surfaced, they were acknowledged rather than avoided. The past remained present, but it no longer governed the future. The season advanced quietly. Grass thickened, the horizon softened. What had once appeared barren revealed depth and resilience. Ellen realized she had stopped bracing herself against loss. She had learned to exist within uncertainty without being consumed by it. Nathan did not change in ways that erased who he had been. He remained reserved, deliberate, but he no longer guarded himself against connection. The distance he once relied upon had given way to proximity that did not threaten his autonomy. He understood now that being beside someone did not require surrendering himself. Their union was not built on idealized hope. It was formed through shared endurance, through choices made under pressure and honored afterward. They stood together not because they needed to be saved, but because they chose not to leave. Spring continued its careful advance. New growth replaced what had burned, not as a restoration of what was lost, but as something altered and alive. The land did not return to what it had been. It became something else, stronger in some places, more fragile in others, honest in its limits. The ending did not arrive with ceremony. There was no moment that marked completion. Life continued forward, shaped by what had occurred, but not bound to it. Two people remained where they were, not held by fear, not driven by escape. The story did not close. It extended, rooted in ground that had learned how to hold fire and still grow. If stories like this resonate with you, slow and grounded, born from silence, fear, and choice, consider subscribing to Dust and Devotion Tales. Here we tell stories that do not shout, but remain.